True love, that which is sold to us as a promise of completeness, harmony and destiny, stands as one of modernity's greatest myths. Nietzsche never believed in easy comforts, much less in the idea that loving was a gentle dive into crystal-clear waters. For him, love was always crossed by dark forces, the desire for possession, the need for power, the fear of solitude. What we call romance often amounts to nothing more than a carefully constructed performance designed to give meaning to lives that, in silence, fear emptiness. If Nietzsche tore away the veil of religious illusions, he also made it his mission to expose the farce of emotional illusions. What if true love in reality were merely a mask for the instinct of domination? What would happen if we recognized that we love not to merge with the other, but to survive in a game of forces where nobody wants to lose? This reflection may be uncomfortable, but it is liberating. Because only when we dismantle the lie can we touch life's real intensity. From early on, we are fed the promise that true love is that which lasts forever. Children's stories always end in marriage, as if that were existence's climax. Songs repeat the same melody, "Only you complete me, only you are enough for me." Soap operas and films reinforce the belief that eternal love is the ultimate goal of all human life. But Nietzsche, always suspicious of the ideals they sell us, saw in this a dangerous artifice, a myth created not to liberate, but to imprison. Love's forever is neither a biological reality nor a spontaneous experience. It is an imposed morality, an expectation that suffocates desire's very vitality. Nietzsche understood that love, like everything born from the human, is dynamic, contradictory, marked by forces that move and transform. The idea of eternity, conversely, freezes movement, imprisons life in a rigid form, incapable of embracing reality's flow. What we call eternal love is nothing more, therefore, than a metaphysical invention, an attempt to domesticate that which by nature is unstable. To love is not a fixed state. It is a game of intensities. It is the encounter of two wills that sometimes attract, sometimes repel. When we believe in the myth of forever, we transform love into debt. We create an impossible expectation that the other desires us today, tomorrow, and until the end of our days, without failures, without pauses, without contradictions. But life doesn't work that way. Desire grows tired. Coexistence wears down. Reality shows its raw face. What Nietzsche alerts us to is that by insisting on this ideal, we condemn love to frustration. The more we demand eternity, the faster we perceive finitude. This illusion is not merely romantic, but profoundly moral. Religions and family traditions have always reinforced the idea of eternal commitment as a form of control. Indissoluble marriage, the promise before God, the moral condemnation of divorce. All of this served as an instrument of social discipline. Nietzsche saw in this a strategy to domesticate instincts, a way to transform desire, which is vital force, into submission. The myth of forever doesn't spring from love, but from the need to control bodies and emotions. And yet we continue dreaming of it. Why? Because human beings fear solitude, fear emptiness, fear freedom. It's easier to believe that someone will always be by our side than to accept the radical uncertainty of existence. The myth of eternal love is anesthesia. It spares us the anguish of admitting that nothing is guaranteed. But Nietzsche invites us precisely to cross through this anguish, to accept impermanence as part of life. Only then can love be lived in its real intensity, without masks, without contracts that kill it before it's even born. Imagine a relationship in which two people don't expect eternity, but only presence. A relationship in which the commitment is not to endure, but to be truthful in the instant. This is Nietzsche's proposal, not to believe in infinite promises, but to plunge into the now, into risk, into the creation of each encounter. Love, when freed from the myth of forever, ceases to be a prison and becomes a space of power, where each gesture matters because it is alive, not because it is guaranteed. Nietzsche didn't want to destroy love, but rather to liberate it. He doesn't ask us to live without bonds, but to have the courage to abandon the illusions that prevent us from loving authentically. The myth of eternal love is just another fraud among so many others created to comfort us. And like every cheap consolation, it charges its price, the death of vitality. The Nietzschean challenge is to risk oneself without guarantees, to accept finitude, and precisely because of that, to intensify each experience. By dismantling the myth of forever, Nietzsche opens space for a more honest, more human, more alive love. A love that doesn't need to hide behind promises, but that affirms itself in the instant. Because deep down, what matters is not duration, but intensity. And perhaps it's exactly because of this that loving without eternities is one of the greatest acts of courage we can live. If there is a central key to understanding Nietzsche's thought, it lies in his notion of will to power. Far beyond an obsession with political domination or physical force, it deals with a vital energy, a drive that crosses all living beings, the instinct for expansion, for affirmation, for conquest. Nothing we do lies outside this field of forces, and love, contrary to what many would like to believe, is no exception. To love is not a pure, altruistic, ethereal act. To love is also an exercise of power. Nietzsche dismantles the fantasy that in love we become disinterested angels, devoted only to the other's happiness. This image is a moral invention that tries to mask reality. Deep down, we always seek something when we love. We seek to be desired, we seek influence, we seek to mold the other in our image. Each gesture of care, each word of affection, each apparent renunciation carries within it a trace of possession. Not because we are perverse, but because we are human, and the will to power is inseparable from everything we are. Look around and see simple examples. When someone says, "I want you to be happy, but with me," there is an evident limit there. Love is not total surrender to the other. It is also a territory we want to maintain under our domain. When someone demands fidelity, when they establish rules, when they take offense at an absence of attention, they are not just loving. They are disputing space. They are claiming influence. This doesn't diminish love, but reveals its less naive face. To love is to want to be part of the other's life so intensely that inevitably we enter a game of forces. Nietzsche doesn't condemn this, he merely exposes what we try to hide. To love is not a harmonious fusion, but a battlefield where wills intertwine. Love idealized as pure donation is a deception that weakens us, because it makes us believe we can live without conflict, without jealousy, without struggle. But where there is no struggle, there is no life. Love, when true in its intensity, will always be crossed by tensions, because it is these tensions that reveal that we are alive, that we desire, that we matter. Of course, this vision may seem somber, even cruel. After all, we prefer to think of love as a refuge, not as a field of dispute. But Nietzsche alerts us, by denying this aspect, we become easy prey for illusions. To accept love as will to power is to learn to deal with it without masks, recognizing that, yes, there is desire for possession, there is will for influence, and that this doesn't necessarily need to corrupt the relationship, but can even strengthen it, if assumed with honesty. Imagine a couple that openly recognizes this dynamic. Instead of hiding behind the mask of purity, both accept that they want to make their presence felt in each other's life, that they desire to have influence, that they fight for space. This doesn't mean destruction, but can be an exercise in creation. How to transform struggle into play, dispute into dialogue, will to power into mutual affirmation. It is in this tension that love can become more real and less fragile. Nietzsche saw, therefore, in love not an error in itself, but an illusion when we believe it is only sweetness and surrender. Sweetness exists, yes, but alongside demand. Surrender happens, but never without expecting something in return. Love is made of contradictions, and it is these contradictions that make it so irresistible. Those who expect purity in love inevitably end up disappointed. Those who accept its nature of power may, perhaps, find in it a transformative force. To love, for Nietzsche, is to enter a dangerous game, and perhaps that's what makes it fascinating. There are no guarantees, no eternal serenity, no peace. Love is risk, it is dispute, it is constant creation, and if there is a truth in it, this truth is not in the idea of perfection, but in the courage to assume that power is always at stake. Only then can we love without losing ourselves in illusions, and perhaps even discover a new form of freedom, that of not hiding the truth behind the mask of purity. Few emotions are as intense and as devastating as jealousy. It can make us lose sleep, distrust every gesture, transform caresses into suspicions, and transform love into anguish. In romantic stories, jealousy is frequently treated as proof of love, as if it were natural that those who love would want absolute exclusivity over the other. But Nietzsche saw in this feeling something much deeper and more revealing. Not proof of love, but a manifestation of insecurity and will to possess. Jealousy is born when we believe the other belongs to us. This idea of possession is reinforced by centuries of moral, religious, and social traditions that have shaped our view of relationships. Marriage as a contract of exclusivity, promises of eternal fidelity, the condemnation of desire for other people. All of this feeds the illusion that true love only exists when it is exclusive. But really, Nietzsche provokes us to be suspicious. After all, human desire is multiple, unstable, and trying to imprison it in a single object may be more an act of violence against life than proof of affection. When we feel jealousy, what is actually at stake is not love, but fear of loss. Fear of no longer being desired, fear of not being enough, fear that someone will occupy the place we believe to be ours by right. It is at this point that Nietzsche places his critique. Jealousy reveals our difficulty in dealing with finitude and with the other's freedom. To love, for many, means wanting to control. But when love becomes control, it is no longer love, but prison. Nietzsche is not saying that jealousy can simply disappear, as if it were possible to flip a switch. He recognizes that we are crossed by this feeling. But what he proposes to us is another way of dealing with it. Instead of disguising it as a sign of love, we should recognize it for what it really is, an expression of insecurity and will to power. Only when we name jealousy can we begin to question to what extent it serves us and to what extent it imprisons us. An everyday example helps us understand. Imagine a person who prohibits their partner from talking to certain people, from going out alone, or from maintaining old friendships. This control is justified as care or concern, but deep down, it is fear of losing influence, fear of no longer being the center. Love, in this scenario, weakens because it ceases to be encounter and becomes surveillance. Jealousy, in this case, doesn't protect love, but corrodes it silently. For Nietzsche, accepting the other's freedom is one of the greatest proofs of strength. To love without demanding absolute exclusivity doesn't mean accepting betrayals or giving up personal values, but it means recognizing that the other is not our property. They are a being in movement, with desires, wills, and paths that we don't control. If love cannot deal with this freedom, it becomes merely a contract of domination disguised as affection. Of course, this vision is uncomfortable because it touches on our greatest fragilities. We want to be unique to someone. We want to occupy an irreplaceable place. But Nietzsche invites us to think, might this need for exclusivity not be more of a social invention, created to maintain stable and predictable relationships, even if artificial? Jealousy, in this sense, would be less proof of love and more proof of how much we have been shaped by these illusions. To love without falling into this trap requires courage. Courage to accept that we don't control the other's desire. Courage to admit that life is unstable and that no bond is guaranteed. Courage to live love not as possession, but as temporary encounter, intense and always subject to change. This doesn't mean loving less, but loving in a more real, more honest, more human way. In the end, Nietzsche shows us that jealousy is the mirror of our deepest insecurities, and if we want to love without destroying, we need to look at this mirror head-on. Because only when we accept that love is not exclusivity, but movement, do we manage to leave aside the prison of jealousy and open space for a love that breathes, that creates, that lives without drowning in the illusion of possession. Since childhood, we are taught to believe that there is someone destined to complete us, the famous myth of the other half, the soulmate, the magical encounter that resolves our lacks and finally makes us whole. This idea is repeated in songs, tales, films, and even in religious discourses, as if we were incomplete until someone appears to fill our void. Nietzsche, however, saw in this myth not a truth, but a dangerous trap. The belief that we are not sufficient by ourselves. For Nietzsche, life is not about seeking compliments, but about affirming what we are. The myth of complement transforms love into dependence. When we believe we need the other to be whole, we begin to carry an impossible expectation that the other never fails, never changes, never leaves us. We place on their shoulders the weight of saving us from existential emptiness. But no human being can carry this burden without wearing down. That's why so many relationships begin with intensity and end with resentment, because nobody can eternally be someone's lost half. Love, when seen under this optic of complement, becomes a field of illusions. We seek in the other not who they are, but what they represent to us, a promise of completeness. But Nietzsche warns us that this promise is false. The other will never be able to erase our lacks. And perhaps they shouldn't, because it is precisely in them that our creative force lies. What moves us is not the perfection of encounter, but the challenge of dealing with incompleteness. Our desire in this sense is a motor, not a lack. When we project onto the other the function of completing us, we are denying life itself as a flow of forces. Love, instead of being an encounter of potencies, becomes a pact of dependence. We demand that the other sustain us emotionally, and when they fail, we call this disappointment. But disappointment only exists because we feed an unreal expectation. Nietzsche invites us to dismantle this illusion and to face love not as an encounter of halves, but as a clash between two whole forces. Imagine two people who enter a relationship not to be completed, but to overflow. Not because they need to, but because they want to. Not because they are empty, but because they are full of life and choose to share this intensity. In this scenario, love ceases to be a patch and becomes a joint creation, a space of expansion, not dependence. This is the love Nietzsche envisioned, not the fusion of souls, but the game between forces that mutually affirm each other. This doesn't mean love loses its beauty. On the contrary, it becomes even deeper because it doesn't spring from lack, but from abundance. Those who love without expecting to be completed can experience the freedom of being with the other without imprisoning themselves in them. It is a love that breathes, that doesn't fear change, that accepts impermanence. It's also a more courageous love because it doesn't promise eternity, but presence. It doesn't say you are everything I need, but I choose to be here, even though I could be in other places. The myth of complement is comfortable because it spares us the responsibility of dealing with our own solitude. It's easier to believe that someone will come to save us than to face the task of sustaining ourselves. But Nietzsche insists, nobody will come to save us. And it is precisely in this realization that a new force opens, the possibility of loving without illusions, of being with someone not out of necessity, but out of creation. In the end, the lie of complement traps us in a cycle of expectations and frustrations. Dismantling this lie can be painful, but also liberating, because when we stop seeking halves, we begin to live as wholes. And only those who are whole can truly love, not as escape, but as affirmation. To love, then, ceases to be the search for who completes us, and becomes the encounter between two worlds that, when they touch, don't merge, but expand. If there is a myth that shapes our way of loving, this myth was not born spontaneously, nor did it arise from nature. It was constructed. Romantic love, as we know it, is not merely an intimate emotion, but a social invention, cultivated over centuries to serve certain interests. Nietzsche, always attentive to culture's hidden gears, saw in love much more than a personal experience. He perceived it as a power device, a narrative shaped to discipline bodies and organize societies. When we think of love as destiny or as divine revelation, we forget that historically it was frequently tied to control. Indissoluble marriage, for example, didn't arise merely as an expression of affection, but as a contract to protect patrimony, perpetuate lineages, and ensure family stability. Rigid monogamy, reinforced by centuries of religious tradition, was not just a natural choice, but a way to control desires, to avoid social disorders, to keep each individual in their place. In this context, love becomes a political instrument, closer to a norm than to a passion. Nietzsche doesn't deny that there are true feelings in love. What he questions is the way these feelings were appropriated and shaped by institutions. When we believe that loving means following a script, dating, marrying, having children, remaining faithful until death, we are repeating a script written long before we were born. This script was not designed for our individual happiness, but for a system's functionality. Thus, romantic love, in its idealized form, carries less authenticity than we think. A simple example helps visualize this. Think about how we are taught to value grand gestures of love: the public marriage proposal, the commitment ring, the ritualized party before the community. These rituals don't spring only from feelings spontaneity, but from social conventions that reinforce the need for external recognition. Love doesn't suffice in itself. It needs to be validated by society. And when it becomes spectacle, it distances itself from its real intensity to adapt to what is acceptable. Nietzsche saw enormous risk in this. When love submits to external rules, it loses vitality. It begins to be lived not as singular creation, but as repetition of patterns. To love in this scenario ceases to be an act of courage and becomes an act of conformity. The individual stops listening to their instincts and bows before collective expectations. Instead of living an intense and uncertain love, they prefer the security of a recognized contract, even if empty of authenticity. This doesn't mean Nietzsche was against bonds or against stable relationships, but he questioned blind belief in the social model we call love. For him, the true challenge is to separate what is vital force from what is cultural imposition. Is what we feel really ours, or are we just performing inherited roles? Might our pains and frustrations not spring precisely from this discrepancy between living desire and the social mask we try to sustain? To love, under the Nietzschean perspective, requires courage to create one's own path, instead of following the ready-made path. It requires accepting that there may be no universal formulas, no external guarantees, only the risk of inventing, of experimenting, of living something that doesn't need public validation. Love, when freed from social bonds, can become what it truly is. A space of intensity, an encounter that doesn't need justification beyond life itself. In the end, recognizing love as social invention doesn't mean discarding it, but making it more truthful. Because only when we dismantle the myth do we perceive the opportunity it hides, the chance to live love not as a copy of a model, but as a work of creation. And for Nietzsche, there is nothing more vital than this transforming love into art, into play, into potency, into singular expression of the will to live. We arrive at the most challenging point of reflection. If eternal love is a myth, if it is crossed by will to power, if jealousy reveals more possession than surrender, if compliment is a lie, and if romanticism was invented as a social instrument, then what remains? Is it possible to love truthfully after all these veils have been torn? Nietzsche believed so, but not in the way we were taught. Love, for him, doesn't need illusions to exist. On the contrary, it can only flourish fully when we leave illusions behind. To love without illusions is not to love less. It is to love more courageously. It is to look at the other and recognize them in their freedom, in their impermanence, in their contradictions. It is to accept that we cannot possess someone without symbolically killing them, without imprisoning their vitality. Nietzsche invites us to abandon the idea of love as contract and to see it as creation, an aesthetic act, a living work that never repeats in the same form. This perspective is hard because it deprives us of guarantees. To love without illusions means accepting that the other may leave, that desire may change, that nothing is assured. But it is precisely because of this that each instant of love becomes more intense, more truthful. What matters is not the promise, but the presence. Not the forever, but the here and now. Love without illusions is not less profound, but more authentic because it doesn't need to sustain itself on fantasies. We can imagine, for example, two people who decide to live together not because they need to complete each other, nor because they want to guarantee eternity, but because they find in the encounter a potency that makes sense in that moment. There is no demand for absolute exclusivity, nor the illusion that the relationship will save their lives. There is only the conscious choice to share intensities, knowing they may change. This love is not less beautiful. It is freer, more honest, more human. Nietzsche reminds us that life is not made to protect us from risk, but to launch us into it. To love without illusions is precisely to risk oneself, knowing we may suffer, but accepting that suffering is an inseparable part of existence. Unlike romantic love, which promises security and stability, Nietzschean love is made of instability, of creation, of danger. But it is exactly in this danger that we find the chance to live something true that doesn't depend on masks or contracts. To love, thus, becomes an act of life affirmation, a gesture of courage before uncertainty, a way of saying, I know nothing is guaranteed, but I choose to be here. Ooh, it is a love that doesn't fear finitude because it knows that finitude is what gives meaning to intensity. If it were eternal, perhaps it wouldn't have flavor. If it were guaranteed, perhaps it wouldn't have risk. And if it had no risk, it would have no life. In the end, to love without illusions is to accept that there is no true love in the sense that culture taught us. There is no destiny, no halves, no forever. But there is something even more powerful, the possibility of creating at each instant a singular love that doesn't need to imitate any model. A love that doesn't promise eternity, but that, in each encounter, in each gesture, in each look, affirms life in its rawest potency. Nietzsche didn't want us to give up on love. He only wanted us to stop using it as consolation. Because when we leave illusions aside, we discover that to love is not to find salvation, but to live intensely, even before the risk of loss. And perhaps it's precisely there that love becomes more truthful, when we don't need it to last forever, because each instant already carries within itself the eternity of what was lived. Throughout this journey, we dismantled the myth of true love as eternal promise and revealed its hidden gears, the will to power, jealousy disguised as care, the lie of compliment, the social invention that shapes our desire. But we also opened space for a greater possibility, to love without illusions, to love without needing masks, to love as courageous creation before uncertainty. And now remains the question that echoes in silence: which belief about love has imprisoned you the most until today? What city are you watching from? Drop a comment down below and let me know.